The entire gym went silent the moment the biggest fighter in the room crashed onto the mat. Weights stopped clanging. Conversations froze. Even the music playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background. Just seconds earlier, three massive men had been laughing loudly, surrounding a quiet stranger near the training mats. To them, it looked like easy entertainment, another older guy trying to train in a gym full of fighters. They thought they had found their next joke. But what happened next shocked everyone inside that building. Because the man they were mocking didn't panic, he didn't argue, he didn't even raise his voice. He simply moved. One small step, one controlled motion, and in the blink of an eye, the strongest bully in the gym was flying through the air before slamming hard onto the mat. Gasps echoed across the room. Phones slowly lifted into the air as people tried to capture what had just happened. The quiet stranger still stood there calmly, barely breathing harder than before. The bullies looked confused, embarrassed, angry. They thought it had to be luck, but it wasn't. Because the man they were trying to bully wasn't just another gym member. He was a man who had spent decades mastering martial arts, a man who had trained fighters, actors, and professionals around the world, a man whose calm presence hid a level of skill most people in that gym had never witnessed before. His name was Steven Seagal, and the three men who had just tried to humiliate him were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. What started as a simple afternoon workout was about to turn into a moment that everyone in that gym would talk about for years. But the most surprising part? The fight itself wasn't the real lesson. What happened after the fight shocked people even more. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Maybe at school, at work, or even in a gym like this one? Tell me in the comments, and also write where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Now, let's rewind to the moment this entire situation began, inside that crowded gym earlier that afternoon. The entire gym went silent the moment the biggest fighter in the room crashed onto the mat. Weights stopped clanging. Conversations froze. Even the music playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background. Just seconds earlier, three massive men had been laughing loudly, surrounding a quiet stranger near the training mats. To them, it looked like easy entertainment, another older guy trying to train in a gym full of fighters. They thought they had found their next joke. But what happened next shocked everyone inside that building. Because the man they were mocking didn't panic, he didn't argue, he didn't even raise his voice. He simply moved. One small step, one controlled motion, and in the blink of an eye, the strongest bully in the gym was flying through the air before slamming hard onto the mat. Gasps echoed across the room. Phones slowly lifted into the air as people tried to capture what had just happened. The quiet stranger still stood there calmly, barely breathing harder than before. The bullies looked confused, embarrassed, angry. They thought it had to be luck, but it wasn't. Because the man they were trying to bully wasn't just another gym member. He was a man who had spent decades mastering martial arts, a man who had trained fighters, actors, and professionals around the world, a man whose calm presence hid a level of skill most people in that gym had never witnessed before. His name was Steven Seagal, and the three men who had just tried to humiliate him were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. What started as a simple afternoon workout was about to turn into a moment that everyone in that gym would talk about for years. But the most surprising part? The fight itself wasn't the real lesson. What happened after the fight shocked people even more. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Maybe at school, at work, or even in a gym like this one? Tell me in the comments, and also write where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Now, let's rewind to the moment this entire situation began, inside that crowded gym earlier that afternoon. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen a bully get instant karma? And don't forget to write your country name. I love seeing where everyone is watching from. Rick stood only a few inches away from the quiet stranger now. The difference in size between them was obvious. Rick's massive shoulders blocked the light from the overhead lamps, casting a shadow across the training mats. Marcus and Leo stood behind him with wide grins, clearly enjoying the attention the scene was attracting. Around them, gym members slowed their workouts. Some leaned on machines, others pretended to stretch while secretly watching. Everyone could feel the tension building. Rick cracked his knuckles slowly, making sure the sound carried through the room. "So," he said loudly, "you're warming up." The stranger nodded calmly. "Yes." Rick tilted his head and smirked. "And for what exactly?" The man answered without hesitation. "For training." Marcus laughed immediately. "Training? Here?" Leo added. "Buddy, you picked the wrong gym for that." Rick looked the man up and down again. There was nothing flashy about him. No big muscles bulging through tight shirts, no aggressive stance. Just a calm presence that almost looked relaxed. Rick shook his head. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you walked into a fighter's gym thinking nobody would notice." The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he slowly rotated his shoulders again, as if continuing his warm-up. Rick's smirk faded slightly, ignoring him again. That was the one thing Rick couldn't stand, so he stepped even closer, close enough that the man could feel his breath. "You're deaf or something?" Rick snapped. "I'm talking to you." The stranger finally looked directly into Rick's eyes. There was no anger there, only patience. "I hear you," he said calmly. Rick spread his arms dramatically and turned to the small crowd. "You guys hear this?" He pointed at the man. "He hears me." A few nervous chuckles came from the onlookers. Rick turned back. "Then maybe you also heard me ask what you're training for." The stranger spoke quietly. "Improvement." Rick blinked once, then burst out laughing. Marcus nearly doubled over. "Improvement," Marcus repeated. "Man thinks he's in a self-help seminar." Leo slapped Rick's shoulder. "You got to admit, Rick, this guy's funny." Rick shook his head, wiping imaginary tears of laughter. Then his expression hardened again. "All right," he said. "If you're here to train, let's see what you've got." The stranger raised one eyebrow slightly. "I didn't come here to fight." Rick smiled slowly. "Oh, you don't get to decide that." Several people in the gym exchanged worried looks, because Rick had a habit of turning jokes into intimidation very quickly, and today looked no different. Rick stepped forward and grabbed a pair of boxing gloves from a nearby bench. He tossed them toward the stranger. The gloves landed on the mat between them. "Put those on," Rick said. The stranger looked down at the gloves for a moment, then back at Rick. "That's not necessary." Rick's smile vanished. "Oh, it's necessary." The room went quieter. Rick leaned forward again. "Unless," he added, "you're scared." Marcus and Leo immediately started chanting, "Scared, scared, scared." A few people shook their heads in discomfort. Others kept filming. The stranger bent down slowly and picked up the gloves. For a second, it looked like he might actually put them on, but instead, he placed them gently back on the bench. Then he stood upright again. "I told you, I'm not here to fight." Rick rolled his eyes. "You're really starting to annoy me." Then, without warning, Rick shoved him. It wasn't a full punch, just a hard push to the shoulder, but it was enough to make the crowd gasp. The stranger took one step back to keep his balance. Still calm, still quiet. Rick spread his arms again. "What's wrong? You lose your balance already?" No response. Rick shook his head. Unbelievable. Then he leaned closer and whispered loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You know what I think? I think you walked in here hoping nobody would challenge you." The stranger sighed softly. "Challenging someone doesn't make you strong." Rick's eyes narrowed. "Oh, really?" Then Rick shoved him again, harder this time. The stranger didn't fall, but the push clearly crossed a line. A murmur spread through the watching crowd. Even Marcus and Leo stopped laughing for a moment, because now things were escalating. Rick clenched his fists. "Last chance," he said. "Fight or get out of my gym." The stranger looked around the room briefly. He saw people watching nervously, some curious, some worried. Then he looked back at Rick. His calm expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had shifted. Not anger, not fear, just quiet acceptance. He exhaled slowly. "If I show you something, will you leave me alone afterwards?" Rick grinned instantly. "Oh, I promise." Marcus leaned toward Leo. "This is going to be good." The stranger stepped onto the center of the training mat. His posture relaxed again. No raised fists, no aggressive stance, just stillness. Rick walked forward confidently, cracking his neck, rolling his shoulders. He looked at the crowd. "Don't blink," he said proudly. "Won't take long." The stranger nodded slightly. "You're right." Rick raised his fists, and the moment he threw his first punch, everything in the gym changed.
Rick didn't hesitate. The moment the quiet stranger finished speaking, Rick lunged forward with full confidence. His fist shot forward like a hammer, aimed directly at the man's face. Rick had thrown thousands of punches in his life. Heavy punches, fast punches, and usually they landed. But this time, something different happened. Before Rick's fist could connect, the stranger moved. Not fast in the way most fighters move. There was no wild dodge, no dramatic jump backward. Just a small shift of his body, a simple step. Rick's punch sliced through empty air. For a split second, confusion flashed across Rick's face. Then suddenly, the stranger's hand caught Rick's wrist. It wasn't a grab filled with aggression. It looked almost effortless, like someone gently stopping a door from closing. Rick tried to pull his arm back immediately, but he couldn't. His wrist was locked in place. "What the—" Rick didn't even finish the sentence, because the stranger turned his body slightly and applied a subtle twist. In the next instant, Rick's entire balance disappeared. His massive body lifted off the ground, and before anyone in the room could understand what was happening, boom! Rick slammed flat onto the mat. The sound echoed across the gym. Gasps erupted everywhere. A dumbbell dropped in the background. Someone whispered, "No way." Phones immediately lifted higher as people tried to record the unbelievable moment. Rick lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, completely stunned. He blinked several times, trying to process what had just happened. The stranger stood above him calmly, not breathing heavily, not celebrating, just standing there like nothing unusual had occurred. Rick quickly rolled to his side and jumped back onto his feet. His face was now bright red with embarrassment. "That was luck," he snapped. Marcus and Leo looked uncertain now. They had expected Rick to destroy the quiet stranger instantly, but what they had just seen didn't make sense. Rick shook his arms and stepped forward again. "You got lucky," he repeated. Then he threw another punch, this one faster, stronger. But again, the stranger moved. This time he stepped to the side, guiding Rick's arm past him. Then his other hand pressed lightly against Rick's shoulder. The motion looked small, almost gentle, but the effect was explosive. Rick's own momentum carried him forward, his feet tangled, and suddenly he was flying again. Thud! The mat shook as Rick hit the floor for the second time. This time the reaction from the gym was louder. "What? Did you see that? No way!" Even Marcus took a step backward. Leo stared in disbelief. Rick groaned as he sat up. Now anger replaced embarrassment. His pride couldn't handle what was happening. "You think this is funny?" he shouted. The stranger shook his head calmly. "I told you I didn't want to fight." Rick stood up again, breathing heavier now. "Stop talking!" He rushed forward wildly, punch after punch, but every strike met the same result. The stranger wasn't fighting him, he was redirecting him. A slight turn of the wrist, a shift of the hips, a quiet step, and every time Rick attacked, Rick ended up losing his balance. Another controlled throw, another crash to the mat. The gym was completely silent now, except for Rick's frustrated breathing. Nobody laughed anymore, nobody mocked. They were watching something entirely different now. Skill, control, experience. Rick tried one more desperate charge, but before he could even throw a punch, the stranger stepped forward. His hand guided Rick's arm, his foot shifted behind Rick's leg, and with a smooth motion, Rick flipped through the air one final time. Boom! This slam was the hardest yet. Rick stayed on the mat longer this time. Not injured, just defeated. The stranger stepped back and gave him space. Still calm, still respectful. Around them, whispers spread through the crowd. One woman near the treadmill area leaned towards her friend. "Wait, that move, I've seen that before." Another man zoomed in with his phone camera. "Hold on," he murmured. "Is that—" Someone near the back suddenly spoke louder. "Guys, I think that's Steven Seagal." The name traveled through the gym like electricity. Steven Seagal? No way. It can't be. Rick slowly pushed himself up again. Sweat dripped from his face now. He stared at the man standing calmly in front of him. The same calm eyes, the same relaxed posture. But suddenly, Rick saw him differently. Not as a quiet stranger, not as an easy target, but as someone far more dangerous than he had imagined. Rick swallowed hard. "You—" His voice cracked slightly. "You're Steven Seagal?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded once, and the entire gym erupted in shocked whispers.
For a moment, no one in the gym spoke. The name hung in the air like electricity. Steven Seagal. Several people repeated it quietly, almost as if saying it out loud might confirm the unbelievable truth standing right in front of them. Phones lifted higher. Some gym members stepped closer to the mat. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. "Is it really him? I think it is. Look at his face. That's definitely him." Rick stood frozen in place. Just minutes ago, he had been laughing, mocking, and pushing the quiet stranger. Now that same stranger stood calmly across from him, barely breathing harder after throwing one of the biggest men in the gym around like it was nothing. Rick's chest rose and fell heavily. His confidence, which had filled the room earlier, was completely gone. "You're Steven Seagal?" Rick asked again, his voice much quieter this time. The man nodded slightly. "Yes." The reaction from the crowd was instant. A wave of murmurs spread across the gym. "Man, I knew it! That's crazy! No wonder he moved like that." One guy near the weight racks shook his head. Rick just tried to bully a martial arts legend. Marcus slowly stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Wait, like the Steven Seagal?" he asked. "The martial arts master?" Steven gave a calm half-smile. "I've practiced for a while." A few people laughed nervously, but Rick didn't laugh. He looked down at the mat where he had slammed into the ground just seconds earlier, 3 times, each time faster than he could react, each time without the man even looking angry. Rick ran a hand through his hair and took a step back. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered. Steven looked at him calmly. "That's not the point." Rick looked confused. Steven continued speaking in the same steady tone. "You shouldn't need to know someone's name to treat them with respect." Those words hit harder than any throw. The gym fell silent again. Rick's friends stood awkwardly behind him now, unsure what to say. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Just minutes ago, they had been the loudest people in the room. Now they barely looked up. Meanwhile, several gym members who had stayed quiet earlier now watched Rick carefully, some with curiosity, some with satisfaction, because many of them had been on the receiving end of Rick's arrogance before. Near the back of the gym, an older trainer named Carlos folded his arms and smiled slightly. He had seen thousands of fights in his career, but what impressed him wasn't the throws, it was the control. Steven hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't tried to hurt anyone. He had simply defended himself, and done it with complete precision. Rick looked back up slowly. "So you're telling me all those moves?" "Aikido," Steven said calmly. Rick blinked. "Aikido?" Steven nodded. a martial art built on balance and redirection. Rick glanced down again, remembering how easily he had been flipped over. Each time he attacked harder, he only made things worse for himself. Rick let out a slow breath. The anger in his body was fading now, replacing it with something unfamiliar: embarrassment. The entire gym had just watched him get humbled in seconds. Marcus leaned closer to him and whispered, "Maybe we should just drop it." Leo nodded quickly. "Yeah, this isn't going our way." But Rick didn't respond. He kept staring at Steven, trying to understand how someone who looked so calm could be so dangerous. Finally, Rick spoke again. "You could have hurt me," he admitted. Steven shrugged slightly. "But I didn't." Another silence filled the room. Then someone in the crowd said loudly, "Man, Rick picked the worst person in the world to bully." A few people laughed. Rick didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. Steven stepped back slightly, giving Rick space. "I came here to train, not to prove anything." Rick slowly nodded. The tension that had filled the gym earlier was fading, but something else was replacing it. Respect. Real respect. Not fear, not intimidation, but the kind of respect that comes when someone shows true mastery without arrogance. Rick rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I guess I misjudged you." Steven's calm eyes met his again. "Most people do." And that simple sentence left the entire gym thinking about something deeper than just the fight they had witnessed, because what happened next would surprise everyone even more.
The tension inside Ironforge Gym slowly faded, but the silence remained. Everyone was still processing what they had just witnessed. Only minutes earlier, the room had been full of laughter and mocking voices. Now, the same people stood quietly, watching the two men in the center of the mat. Rick shifted his weight awkwardly. For the first time since he had joined the gym, he didn't look confident. He looked human. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he stared at Steven, trying to find the right words. I didn't know who you were," Rick finally said again. Steven's expression stayed calm. "That's exactly the problem," he replied. Rick frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Steven stepped a little closer, but his voice remained steady and controlled. "You shouldn't have to know someone's reputation before you show them respect." The words landed heavily. Several people around the gym nodded quietly. They all understood what he meant. Rick looked down at the mat again. He remembered how he had laughed, how he had pushed Steven, how he had tried to turn the whole situation into a joke for the crowd. Now that same crowd was watching him with completely different expressions. Not fear, not admiration, just awareness. Rick rubbed his hands together nervously. "I guess I got carried away." Marcus and Leo stood a few steps behind him, unusually quiet. The two men who had been laughing the loudest earlier now looked uncomfortable. Steven glanced at them briefly, then back at Rick. "You're strong," Steven said. Rick looked up, surprised. "But strength isn't just about muscles. It's about discipline, control, and respect." Rick slowly nodded. Those words felt different coming from someone who had just thrown him across the room without even raising his voice. A few gym members nearby exchanged looks. Some were impressed. Others seemed relieved, because this was the first time anyone had ever seen Rick forced to listen. After a moment, Steven extended his hand. The gesture surprised everyone. Rick looked at the hand for a second. Then he shook it. The handshake wasn't about victory. It was about closure. "You okay?" Steven asked calmly. Rick nodded. "Yeah, just my pride that hurts." A few quiet laughs from the crowd. Even Rick managed a small smile. The tension that had filled the room earlier was finally breaking. Near the back of the gym, Carlos, the trainer, walked forward slowly. Carlos had been training fighters for nearly 30 years, and he rarely looked impressed. But this time, he nodded respectfully toward Steven. "That was some of the cleanest control I've seen in a long time," Carlos said. Steven gave a small nod in return. "Just practice." Carlos chuckled. "More like decades of it."
Around the gym, people began relaxing again. Some returned to their workouts. Others continued whispering about what they had just witnessed. But the story was already spreading. One guy near the treadmill area had uploaded the video to his social media. Within minutes, comments were pouring in. Is that really Steven Seagal? No way that guy tried to bully him. Instant karma. Back on the mat, Rick took a deep breath. I owe you an apology, he said. Steven didn't interrupt. Rick continued. I've been coming to this gym for years. I got used to thinking I was the toughest guy here. Steven raised one eyebrow slightly. And now? Rick gave a tired laugh. Now I realize there's always someone better. Steven smiled faintly. That's not the point either. Rick looked confused again. The point, Steven said, is to improve yourself, not prove yourself. Those words hung in the air. For a moment, even the background music from the speakers seemed quieter. Rick slowly nodded. Fair enough. Steven reached for his towel and wiped the sweat from his neck. I really did come here just to train. Rick stepped aside immediately. You're welcome here any time. Marcus and Leo quickly nodded in agreement. Yeah, definitely. Steven glanced around the gym one last time. Most people were watching him with a completely different kind of respect now. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. He picked up his small gym bag and slung it over his shoulder. Then he turned toward the exit. But before leaving, he paused and looked back at Rick. Train hard, Steven said. Rick nodded. I will. Steven gave one final nod to the room and walked toward the door. As the door closed behind him, the gym slowly returned to life. Weights started clanging again. People resumed their workouts. But the atmosphere had changed, because everyone in that room had just witnessed something more than a fight. They had seen a powerful reminder that real strength doesn't need to shout, and real masters rarely look like what you expect.
For the rest of that day, the story spread across Ironforge Gym faster than anyone expected. People who had witnessed the moment couldn't stop talking about it. Some replayed the videos they had recorded on their phones. Others described the scene to members who had arrived later. But interestingly, most of the conversations weren't about the throws. They weren't about how quickly Rick had been flipped onto the mat. They weren't even about the fact that the quiet man turned out to be Steven Seagal. The real topic people kept discussing was something deeper. It was the lesson behind the moment. Later that evening, Rick sat alone near the bench press area, staring at the floor. For the first time since he had started coming to the gym, he wasn't the center of attention. And strangely, he didn't seem to mind. Marcus walked over slowly and sat beside him. That was rough, Marcus said quietly. Rick let out a small laugh. Yeah, you could say that. Leo joined them a moment later. You know, Leo added carefully, most people would have tried to knock you out after you pushed them like that. Rick nodded slowly. Yeah. But Steven hadn't done that. Instead, he had stayed calm, controlled, respectful, even after being mocked and shoved. Rick leaned back against the bench and thought about the moment again. Every throw had been precise, every movement controlled. Not once had Steven tried to hurt him. That realization stuck with Rick the most. Carlos, the older trainer, walked by and stopped for a moment. You thinking about what happened? He asked. Rick nodded. Carlos smiled slightly. Good. Rick looked confused. Good? Carlos crossed his arms. Because moments like that are the ones that make fighters better. Rick frowned. How? Carlos gestured toward the training mats. You learned something today most people don't learn for years. Rick raised an eyebrow. What's that? Carlos replied simply. That strength without discipline is just noise. Rick stared at the floor again, letting those words sink in. Around the gym, the normal rhythm had returned. Weights clanged, people trained, music played through the speakers. But the atmosphere felt a little different now. More respectful, more aware. The story of what happened that afternoon had already become part of the gym's history, and it would probably be told to new members for years.
The day Rick tried to bully the wrong guy. Later that night, as the gym prepared to close, Carlos wiped down the training mats where the whole scene had happened. He smiled slightly, because in his decades of coaching fighters, he had seen something important. True masters rarely need to prove anything. They simply show up. They train, and when necessary, they demonstrate their skill quietly. That's exactly what Steven had done. No shouting, no arrogance, just calm control. And that calm control had taught a room full of people something powerful. Because respect isn't something you give only to famous people. It isn't something you give only to strong people. Respect is something you give to everyone, especially the quiet ones. Because sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who has spent years mastering something you know nothing about. And sometimes the biggest lesson in a room doesn't come from the loudest voice. It comes from the calmest one. That day inside Ironforge Gym, people didn't just see a fight. They saw humility. They saw discipline. And they saw the difference between arrogance and true strength. Because real power doesn't need to shout. Real power simply exists. And those who truly understand martial arts know one thing better than anyone else. The strongest fighter in the room is often the one who stays the calmest.
Comment respect if you believe humility is real strength. And tell me which part of this story surprised you the most. Your feedback helps us make even better stories for the next video.